No one in the room fired a missile. No one crossed a border. No general announced that war had begun. But for several nights in November 1983, machines built for the end of civilization began to move as if the unthinkable had already started. The public saw none of it. In Western Europe, NATO officers sat inside command posts and rehearsed a war that was not supposed to be real. Messages moved through secure channels. Codes were tested. Procedures were practiced. The exercise had a name that sounded almost harmless, Able Archer 83. On paper, it was a command post drill. In Moscow, it looked like something else. It looked like the opening shadow of a nuclear first strike. That was the danger. Not a speech. Not a battlefield. Not a single dramatic order shouted across a map. The danger was interpretation. One side was practicing the end of the world. The other side was asking whether the practice was a mask. By 1983, the Cold War had entered one of its most dangerous emotional climates since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The language between Washington and Moscow had hardened. The Soviet Union had been called an evil empire by the American president. The United States was preparing to deploy Pershing II missiles in Europe, weapons whose short flight times made Soviet leaders fear that warning time could shrink to minutes. The Kremlin was old, sick, suspicious, and surrounded by intelligence reports telling it to watch for signs of a surprise attack. Then, on September 1, 1983, Soviet air defenses shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it strayed into Soviet-controlled airspace. 269 people were killed. The West saw brutality. Moscow saw intrusion, espionage, and encirclement. Every radar return became more meaningful. Every American movement became more threatening. Every exercise became a question. Inside the KGB, that question already had a name, Operation Ryan, short for nuclear missile attack. Soviet intelligence officers were instructed to search for indicators that the United States and NATO were preparing a sudden strike. They watched military bases, government buildings, communications patterns, civil defense activity, even signs that leaders might be moving to shelters. The system was designed to detect danger. But a system built to find danger can begin to manufacture it from fragments. That is how a rehearsal becomes a warning. Able Archer began in early November. NATO had run exercises before. The Soviets knew the annual pattern. But the 1983 version carried features that made it feel sharper: new nuclear release procedures, high-level command communications, and a scenario that moved from conventional conflict toward simulated nuclear use. NATO files later described it as a command post exercise involving headquarters, not troops maneuvering on the ground. But Moscow was not reading the exercise from NATO's paperwork. It was reading signals, movements, and fear. And fear changes the meaning of evidence. The Soviet leadership had studied history through the wound of 1941, when Nazi Germany attacked after deception, warnings, and disbelief. In that memory, an enemy exercise could be a cover. A political statement could be camouflage. A routine alert could be the final step before attack. The lesson was simple and terrifying: if you wait until certainty arrives, you may already be dead. So the watchers watched harder. From the Western side, Able Archer was a simulation. From the Soviet side, it entered a world already primed for suspicion. The Pershing II deployment was coming. American naval and air activity had become more aggressive. Intelligence services were searching for nuclear indicators. And Yuri Andropov, the Soviet leader, governed through illness and distrust while the machinery around him listened for proof that the enemy was preparing to strike. The proof did not have to be perfect. It only had to fit the fear. During the exercise, US and NATO communications simulated the political steps that could precede nuclear release. The scenario escalated. The language of command became more serious. Messages moved through channels that, to an observer outside the room, could resemble preparations rather than theater. In a nuclear system, the difference between theater and preparation can be almost invisible. Then the Soviet reaction appeared. Declassified accounts later showed that Soviet air units in Eastern Europe were placed on heightened readiness. A National Intelligence Daily item dated November 10, 1983, noted increased alert activity among Soviet air forces. Later evidence made the picture darker. Lieutenant General Leonard Perroots, then a senior U.S. Air Force intelligence officer in Europe, would write years afterward that signals intelligence showed Soviet forces had reacted in a way that could have led to a potentially disastrous situation. This was the hinge of the story. Perroots saw unusual Soviet activity. His commander asked whether American forces should increase their real alert posture in response. That is the moment when a rehearsal could have become a ladder. One alert answered by another. One precaution interpreted as confirmation. One military system teaching the other to panic. Perroots did not recommend escalation. He chose to watch. At the time, he did not know everything. He later admitted that if he had known then what he learned afterward, he was uncertain what advice he would have given. That sentence is frightening because it reveals how much depended on incomplete information, instinct, and restraint inside a system designed for speed. No public announcement marked the decision. No crowd saw it. No headline understood it. Yet the choice not to generate more American forces may have been one of the quietest acts of de-escalation in the late Cold War. The secret was not that NATO planned to start a war. The evidence does not show that. The secret was that NATO's routine could enter Soviet warning systems as something far more dangerous. A command post exercise, when placed inside the psychology of 1983, could look like a countdown. And inside Moscow's intelligence machine, the countdown was already imagined. Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB officer secretly working for British intelligence, later helped the West understand the depth of Soviet anxiety. His reporting suggested that Soviet officials were not merely performing propaganda for outside consumption. Some of them genuinely feared a Western surprise attack. Western analysts debated how far that fear reached into the highest levels of the Kremlin. Some argued the danger has been exaggerated. Others pointed to the alerts, the intelligence requirements, and the later classified assessments as evidence that the risk was real enough to matter. History often hides in that space, not certainty, but enough uncertainty to kill. The President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board later concluded that the United States may have inadvertently placed relations with the Soviet Union on a hair trigger. That phrase matters. It does not accuse one side of secretly choosing Armageddon. It describes something colder, a system in which ordinary actions, filtered through distrust, could produce extraordinary danger. The terrifying part is that no one needed to be irrational. NATO officers were doing what military organizations do, rehearsing procedures for a crisis they hoped would never arrive. Soviet officers were doing what frightened states do, searching for signs that the enemy might attack first. Intelligence analysts were doing what analysts do under pressure, trying to decide whether unusual activity was training, deception, or preparation. Each part could be explained. Together, they formed a machine that pointed toward catastrophe. That is the hidden power of closed rooms. They do not merely make decisions. They create interpretations for other closed rooms. In Washington, President Ronald Reagan would soon confront the possibility that Soviet leaders truly believed the United States might launch a nuclear first strike. Accounts from inside his administration describe a sobering effect. The idea disturbed him. If the enemy really believed you were preparing to destroy him, then your strength could become a signal of danger, your exercises could become threats, and your words could push frightened men closer to irreversible decisions. This did not make Reagan soft. It made the risk visible. Within months, the tone of U.S.-Soviet relations began to shift. Reagan spoke more openly about the horror of nuclear war. Back channels and diplomacy mattered more. The Cold War did not end because of Able Archer alone. History is rarely that clean. But the scare exposed a truth that powerful men could no longer ignore: deterrence depends not only on weapons, but on what the other side believes those weapons mean. In a crisis, perception is a weapon. The Soviet Union did not launch. NATO did not escalate. The exercise ended. The alerts faded. The documents returned to safes. For the public, nothing had happened. That was the most disturbing part. The world had moved close to danger without the world knowing it was in danger. Years later, declassified documents gave the episode its shape. The National Security Archive collected the records. The CIA history, the shape files, the Perroots addendum, the Presidential Advisory Report, and research into Operation Ryan all revealed pieces of the same dark pattern. A system built to prevent surprise had nearly been surprised by its own fear. There was no single villain in the room. That makes the story harder, and more useful. The lesson is not that exercises should never happen, or that strength has no place, or that every alert is madness. The lesson is that power becomes most dangerous when it forgets how it appears from the other side of the wall. A nation can believe it is signaling resolve while another believes it is watching preparation for murder. A command can believe it is practicing procedure while an adversary believes it is seeing the last rehearsal before impact. And once that belief takes hold, the room gets smaller. Able Archer 83 ended without fire because some people did not climb the next rung. Because uncertainty was allowed to remain uncertainty. Because a senior officer watched instead of answering fear with fear. Because the machinery of war, for once, did not receive the extra push it was built to obey. The world survived a decision most people never knew existed. That is why the story matters now. Not as nostalgia. Not as a Cold War curiosity. But as a warning about every age that trusts speed, secrecy, and weapons more than understanding. The most dangerous moment may not arrive with sirens. It may arrive as a message on a secure line, a change in readiness, a report that fits an old fear, a room full of serious men deciding whether the movement outside is routine or the beginning of the end. The public version of history is often written after the danger has passed. But the real version is written earlier, in silence, when no one is watching, and when one restrained decision can keep the world from learning how close it came.